Oh, I just want to focus on that.
To the Branson Legacy Sabbath School class. Today we're kind of having two disjointed series this month. Next week we're going to have Ron Graybill and Gil Valentine will report on a recent conference about Adventist history that they just came back from the East Coast on. And then on the last February 24th, Zach Plantak will continue that. Now again, that's going to be 2 weeks after they're here. Today, we're having Mailen Kootsey, who's going to be speaking on about his new book, which is in, review process right now. So, and he's going to be discussing about relationships. And then he'll come back in 2 weeks to finish up. So, today will be the first part of that. So I'm going to introduce Mailen Kootsey. Mailen's a graduate of PUC, and then he earned his doctorate at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, a lot of people don't realize Brown University is one of the Ivies. And he's been an administrator at Andrews University, Duke University, which is in North Carolina, and then was here at Loma University. I think we're academic dean at Andrews for a while. Vice president for academics, or okay.
The arts and sciences.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's quite a Renaissance man. Not only does he have a degree in physics, but he's a musician. I guess they kind of fit together. His wife Lynn, they live here in Loma Linda.
Redlands, actually.
Okay.
Close enough.
Close enough. They have 2 sons and 3 grandchildren. And one of the most important things about him is he likes cats. And so, dogs have owners, cats have what? Staff. So, we talk about cats a lot. But Mailen, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Today, Mailen, thank you for being with us. We look forward to your discussion today about relationships, and then we'll see you in 2 weeks after that. Thank you.
Thanks, Forrest. And thanks to the class for giving me some time to talk about things that I find fascinating. Could we have the lights down up front here? Let me tell you how these 2 weeks are going to work. My main purpose here in speaking with you is to describe an organizational structure that includes not only science but other human activities as well, including religion, education, and other kinds of things. And not only to describe that structure, but to describe some conclusions that I find interesting that come from that structure. But in order to really appreciate that structure, I want to start my presentation with some background history. So today, what I will do is to go through that background history. Today I'll describe and go through that background history and just introduce the structure that I want to talk about, but I won't get to say too much about it today or draw many conclusions. That'll be the job for my second part, which will be in 2 weeks, as Forrest has said. Humans are unique among living creatures, as far as we know, in their ability to think about and communicate abstract ideas. Certainly other creatures, dolphins and elephants, have communication, probably more than we know, but we're not aware that they are capable of thinking about and organizing abstract ideas. The most important abstract ideas that people have thought about over the centuries and millennia certainly have to do with their survival, where to get food, how to stay away from predators, how to and so on. And that's what I want to talk about. I'll just refer to that whole area of thinking as a worldview. How do humans relate to the world they live in, which includes not only other animals and other creatures, but also other humans as well. And what I'd like to suggest to you today is that there's basically been 3 periods in human history that have distinctly different approaches to a human world view. 3 phases that I call early human history, Middle Ages, and then the modern era. So today I'm going to go through phase 1 and 2 and just get started on phase 3. I'm sorry you're missing the quotation at the bottom here. We have a little mismatch between the size of the screens. So I'll read it to you. There is no culture recorded in human history which has not practiced some form of religion. That's by Joshua J. Mark, an anthropologist. So what can we say about this early phase in human history? There are early hints that early humans thought about things beyond their immediate life and survival for that day. Signs of preparations and decorations at burial, for example. Another kind of information that comes fairly early in human history. This is from the Lower Paleolithic period or Lower Old Stone Age, dated at about 17,000 years. Very famous caves in France, Lascaux, France. Quite artistic actually, and attractive, but these are buried in rather deep caves. So people have asked, what was the purpose of the humans at that age and stage drawing art like this on the walls of caves? Were they trying to gain some magic over their prey that they hunted? That doesn't seem too likely. This animal is most likely an auroch, A-U-R-O-C-H, which was a precursor of modern cattle, and it was a big animal with fierce horns, as you can see. Therefore, not a really easy target for humans with stone tools. There certainly was no iron or brass at that early age. So it's probably not just looking for hunting magic, maybe protection from being chased by one of these, possibly. This is another one from the same cave in France. What you see there is a person, a human, with a bird mask on. You can see the bill and some feathers sticking out behind the head. Probably a bison on the right-hand side, a big one. But people paid a lot of attention to this bird on a pole there. And they draw the conclusion, anthropologists draw the conclusion from this drawing, that that's probably a shaman. And the bird on a pole probably represents the supernatural, that is, some form of god or gods outside of the natural realm. Well, these are just a couple of things. I'm no specialist in those ages in anthropology, but it seems pretty clear that human interest in things beyond the physical world that they were used to started quite early for Homo sapiens. Following this lower Paleolithic era came the Neolithic era, and the religious symbols, possibly religious symbols, moved from deep caves where they were probably only accessible to the shamans, certainly not big enough room for even a big family or big tribe to get in there and do any kind of religious rituals. So these symbols moved to the surface on pillars. Similar symbols were there. And so the ancient religions started up in the Neolithic period. names of the city-states that you have heard all had their own independent religions. Mesopotamia, which consisted of Sumer, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, all had their own independent religions, as did Greece and Rome. And all these religions had some common beliefs. Every one of them had this set of beliefs I'm going to show you here. First of all, a supernatural realm not accessible to humans, a creation by a supernatural entity, other lesser supernatural beings. In the Bible, these would be angels, but the other religions also had lesser supernatural beings. All of the supernatural beings take a personal interest in humans. The relationship between the supernatural beings and humans require from the humans, that is, worship and ritual sacrifice, and an afterlife in the supernatural. The kind of afterlife depending on actions in this present life. These are all characteristics of the independent religions of these city-states at that time. And even this, a God figure who is killed and returns to life for the good of his people. That's not unique to Christianity. In Phoenicia, this God figure was Baal. In Mesopotamia, the God figure that died and came back was Tammuz. And in Greece, it was Attis. So similar figures were known in the other religions as well. So once again, the summary of that first period, I would say, you didn't see the title earlier because it was partly cut off. Summary is God's rule, or God rules, depending on whether you were a monotheistic religion or had multiple gods. That information that I showed you there comes both from the Bible and from archaeologists and anthropologists. So let's move on to the next period. The dominant idea during this next period was something that you don't see at the top because it got cut off. It's called the Great Chain of Being. And we'll go to the next slide where you can see the title. This idea lasted for essentially 2,000 years. It governed the way people thought about the world they lived in, and it governed their relationships in their culture as well. This book is a very detailed history of that period. The book is actually a transcription of a series of lectures, the William James Lecture Series at Harvard, 1932 and 33 by Arthur Lovejoy. Now, how did this great chain of being originate, and what were the ideas in it? The ideas started with Plato. He did not live to see the entire chain defined as we'll see it in a moment, but it started with some of his thinking. In particular, if you have read Plato or know about Plato, you know that one of the things he did was to suggest that there are two realms, the realm we live in and another realm that has the perfect versions of the things that appear in our physical realm. He called these the ideas, that is, the things in the supernatural realm that were perfect were the ideas, and down here we had just the imperfect reflections of those. For example, the perfect ideal tree is in this supernatural realm. Down here we just have poor excuses for that ideal, deformed, imperfect in many ways. one of those ideas was the idea of the good. Now, people later assumed that he was thinking of God or of a God about that, although Plato never said that. But philosophers who took up this idea from Plato, the idea of ideas, capital I, assumed that the idea of the good was God or a God. Part of the ideas that formed the chain of being was that this God, as a perfect God, in order to complete his perfection, had to create. And what would a perfect God create but everything possible that could be created? Because if there was anything missing that was not part of the creation, then the creation would be imperfect. And this then is the idea of plenitude. That word was not used until Arthur Lovejoy coined it, but the idea was there early on. Plenitude meaning that the creation had to have in it everything that could possibly be created. And associated with that is the idea of continuity, which you can't read here, unfortunately. Continuity meant that in this creation there were only slots for the things that could possibly be created, and there were no empty slots. Now, Plotinus, several centuries later, was one of the people who wrote the best and clearest definition of this great chain of being. How then should the most perfect being and the first good remain shut up in itself as though it were jealous or impotent, itself the potency of all things? Something must therefore be begotten of it. Now we have this, another century or two later, written by Macrobius, summarizing Plotinus's ideas. Since from the supreme God mind arises, and from mind soul, and since this in turn creates all subsequent things and fills them with all life, and since this single radiance illuminates all and is reflected in each as a single face might be reflected in many mirrors placed in a series. If I can pause there, his picture is two mirrors facing each other. If you've been in a fitting room or something like that, you know what happens then. You see yourself over and over again, smaller and smaller and fainter. That's the picture that he's writing about here. So mirrors placed in a series, and since all things follow in continuous succession, degenerating in sequence, the very bottom of the series, the attentive observer will observe a connection of parts from the supreme God down to the last dregs of things, mutually linked together and without a break. And this is Homer's golden chain, which God, he says, bade hang down from heaven to earth. So here's the chain of being, then, in summarized form. God at the top, which you can't see, but God is up there. All the way down to minerals at the bottom and rocks in plain English. The scale of this drawing is soul. That is, God is 100% soul and mind. And as you move down the scale, whatever level you're at has less soul. So right below God would be the angels. And here it's just shown as one level, but the idea was that there were all the levels of angels in a hierarchy. Archangel at the top, the lesser administrators next, and so on to the lowest angel. And then the evil angels, the demons below that, similarly organized, I guess. And below that, humans, once again, broken down into many layers. The kings at the top, the rulers, the rich people, eventually you get to the common people, and finally to the weak and the poor at the bottom. Scaled, again, by soul, the kings having more soul than the poor people at the bottom. And this obviously fit in with someone's idea of how society should be structured as well. So each of those groups is stratified. Animals coming below that, then plants, and finally rocks and minerals below with zero soul. Here's a drawing from the 15th to 16th century of the chain of being. Unfortunately, part of the picture of God up here is cut off, but you see the angels below, and then the kings and rulers, other humans. They don't have as many layers in this drawing, but that's the way people thought about it. This drawing has the birds next, and then the domestic animals, and the wild animals, the plants. What you can't see here, I can see on my screen, is that the very bottom layer is hell. So here are all the sinners burning away at the bottom. And this reflected the idea that it was believed during this period that hell actually was in the middle of the earth. So while we say often that it was a geocentric universe, which we'll see in a moment, it actually was a hell-centered universe, a diabolo-centric universe. Now, what conclusions do we have from the chain of being? First of all, the earth is fundamentally static and unchanging. No new species would be expected because everything that could be created had been created. A being cannot rise above its level in the chain. There's no American dream here. If you're born poor, don't even think about rising to a higher level. That was your spot, and there are no more empty levels above you to move to. That's the problem. Well, people didn't like that very well, and after many centuries, that idea was finally given up, and it was admitted that there was probably a lot of empty spots above the highest humans that people could move into. But anyway, this was one of the beliefs for a long period of time. Ranking implies value, so not are you lower or higher on the soul scale, but on the value as a being, as a person, as a human. Evil and predation were in this chain as well as the good. Some thought even that there might be some of God's creation on other planets. They knew that there were planets, but they didn't know anything about them much, of course. They knew that they had slightly different orbits. This whole idea, of course, was based on philosophy. It was not based on observations other than the planets and the sun and the moon were there. Totally based on that, but it influenced the religion, the governments, and the arts. If you read poetry from that time, I don't have time to read you poetry here, but the poetry reflects the belief in the great chain of being. Here are some of the, well, you can't see it, I'll read the names off, some of the well-known names in science and well, not science, but in philosophy and natural history. Aristotle, Spinoza, Leibniz, Galileo, Descartes, Bacon, Kant, Aquinas. All of these were supporters of the great chain of being. And the cosmology that went along with the great chain of being was the cosmology of Aristotle and Ptolemy. That is, the universe centered at the center of the earth, and all the other, the moon, the sun, the stars, planets, all circle the earth on perfect crystalline spheres. Again, the sphere being a perfect shape, everything in this universe has to be perfect. Ptolemy's addition was to make some corrections in that to give a more accurate prediction of the planet's movement. They had an erratic back and forth movement, and he made a correction for that. Why did the chain of being come to an end? Around the 16th century, people started finding fossils and discovering other things that were changing in the universe. It gradually became clear that the universe was not static and unchanging at all, but there had to be changes going on. This is only a beginning, and people started paying more attention to observations and experiment. See, this great chain came from pure philosophy and deductive logic. It was not based on experiment and observation, other than the fact that they just looked up and saw the sun and moon and stars there, but beyond that, they couldn't say much. At that time, just in the beginning in the 16th century, experimental science and inductive logic was beginning, just beginning. And of course, the 18th century was about the time the Enlightenment started as well, on reason and many other changes. So let's take a first look then at the modern era. Now we have the God's rule first, then the great chain of being is the ruling idea, which is more complex, but quite fixed and static. Now, in the modern era, we have a number of names that are familiar to most people. Galileo, Newton, Kepler, Bacon, Descartes, Hooke, and so on. These were the people that we would now call scientists who did not subscribe to this deductive reasoning that had reigned for so long, for 2,000 years essentially. They said, we're looking for principles by which the things that we see occur. These men were not only specialists in particular areas. You probably recognize most of the ones on the left have to do with astronomy. The ones on the right, Bacon really introduced the idea of experiment and theory together to make a kind of scientific method. Harvey was known for the circulation and tracing out the circulation of the blood, the pumping of the heart. Boyle in chemistry, and so on. But these men were not just specialists in those areas that we know most about. Hooke, for example, was a specialist in physics. There's a Hooke's law. But he was also an architect and a lawyer and high up in the government as well. Newton not only invented gravity, but he was a specialist in mathematics, invented the calculus. So all of these men were polymaths, as we use the word now. They understood that there was thinking going on in multiple areas, and they were aware of those, talked to these other people. See, there's a great deal of overlap in their lifetimes. Over the next couple of hundred years, from the 16th century, certainly through the 18th and 19th century, the emphasis became collecting information about nature, about the world that humans lived in. This is, especially in the 19th century, there was a whole flurry of books came out, some for adults and some even for children, explaining and listing the information that people had connected in great detail. This is one, you can see part of it there, it's basically the Book of Nature, written in German, and it claims to be the first handbook of nature written in the German language. This is available on the web. You can see it if you like. There are over 400 pages just giving details of various living things. A few pictures, not too many, obviously no photographs, but a few pictures thrown in. This is one of many kinds of animals. There's one like this for birds, for plants, and so on. Another 400 pages for footnotes and references to other people who were doing similar things, and a long list of names, Latin names for these things that were described. So almost 900 pages in this book. And this is just one, as I say, of many. Some of these series were multi-volume series. Fortunately, the Google Books library has quite a few of these 19th century books available if you'd like to go and look at them for free. Well, during this period of time, lots of other people got into this business of collecting data and information as well. It wasn't just that small group to begin with. Of course, it passed away. But large numbers of people began collecting information and studying in increasingly specialized and narrow areas. I've just listed a few of those there. A couple of them are cut off at the bottom and at the top. But you recognize areas of biology, of physics, of chemistry, things that we now think of that weren't looked at earlier, like ecologies. On the right, you have a number of human activities, which I'm including on this list. You'll see why in a few moments. Not normally thought of as sciences, but I want to make a point of including them in the structure that I want to discuss with you. These disciplines stayed as isolated disciplines for a long period of time. These disciplines defined their own names, their own words, their own terminologies. They built their own individual kinds of measuring apparatus for whatever they needed. They developed their own specialized kinds of theories. Even academic departments in universities were based around these specialties. And degrees were all given in these specialties. Now, I went to college in the second half of the 1950s, and at that time, these disciplines were still as isolated and non-communicative as they were in the 19th century. I was a physics major, and physics majors just didn't talk to chemistry majors. They were clearly deficient. And certainly didn't talk to biology majors. I mean, they really were hardly scientists, because all I did was name things. It was only in the last part of the 20th century that some of these disciplines finally started talking with each other. I'll have some more to say about that later. But let's take a look at this structure. I have now taken those same isolated disciplines that I had on the previous slide and arranged them in a specific order for a good reason. Let me start with atoms. That's the bottom of what you can see. Below that are nuclei and the standard model of subnuclear particles below that. If you put atoms together, what do you get? You get chemistry, right? Well, I've split that into inorganic and organic. Let's follow the organic chain up the line here. If you put organic molecules together, you get biochemical reactions. If you put biochemical reactions together, you get cells. And if you put cells together, you get organs. If you put organs together, you get organ systems. Put organ systems together, you get animals and humans. And I could follow the other chain up. For example, inorganic goes to geochemistry, geology, and so on. Eventually we get to ecologies, when you put microbiology together with plants and animals and humans. On the other side, geology ultimately forms the earth. Humans, put humans together, linked together, and you find a lot of different kinds of things happening. And that's the purpose of the list on the right. That's not a hierarchy, it's simply a list of kinds of things that happen when humans get together and communicate. That includes families, of course, but it also includes religion, it includes economics, the arts, education, technology, and the list could go on. There's dot, dot, dot at the bottom. And once again, I emphasize that's not meant in any way to mean a hierarchy, simply a list. What scale should we use to measure height on this particular chart? It's not Seoul anymore, I'll tell you that. Well, everything in this chart is made of the same atoms, so it's pretty clear that as we go up the chart, things get bigger physically because we're putting more and more atoms together. So we could use size, which you can barely see, as a measure of height in this chart. But also, we could use complexity, because when we put more pieces together, certainly the interactions get more interesting and more productive. So I have chosen to call this chart the tree of complexity. And that's the structure that I'd like to talk with you about for the remaining few minutes this morning and for part 2, where we'll be able to draw a number of conclusions that I hope you will find interesting. Now that chart is clearly a hierarchy. There are 2 kinds of hierarchies. This is the first kind, the hierarchies of command and order. On the left, we have a structure that could belong to a business, or it could belong to an organization of a military group, Army, Marines, or whatever. But it's clearly a command hierarchy. Down below, we have Maslow's hierarchy of basic human needs. On the right, we have a technical hierarchy. This is the way the information in your computer is organized. There's a directory at the top. That directory has other directories in it, maybe even another layer of directories. And finally, you get to the files, which are your documents and your pictures and all the other things that you've organized. That's one kind of hierarchy, command and order. The tree that I showed you is not this kind of hierarchy. It's not a hierarchy of command and order. It is a hierarchy of structure, which is quite a different animal completely. Let's compare these two. An object at any one layer, one level in a command or order hierarchy, we would just call a member or an object. In a structure hierarchy, a new name has been coined. This was coined by the very prolific author Arthur Koestler in the 1960s. He calls it a holon, and I'll show you in a moment why a new word is needed. So we call the structure ones hierarchies, and the command and order type hierarchies, and structure hierarchies, we really call them holarchies. Span refers to the number of objects or members at any one level. How many are there, different kinds? And depth refers to how many layers there are in the hierarchy, and those words apply to either kind. Let me give you the characteristics of a holon. There are basically four I would like you to remember. An object, holon, is basically a whole. It's something that has agency and can survive by itself as long as it's in the right environment. Even a cell can survive as long as it's in water, it has the right solution, things in the solution. But it can also be a part. That is, it can join together with other holons at the same or even other levels to communicate with them. So it has the characteristic of communion. When a holon loses its agency, dies, in other words, it breaks apart, it self-dissolves into lower level holons. So we say it has the characteristic of self-dissolution. And finally, when it joins with others, what happens? We call that synthesis or self-transcendence, because when you put holons together at one level, you get totally new properties that are not known or even easily predicted just by looking at the basic holons themselves. The word emergence is used, and I'll have more to say about that later. So if you can remember those, agency, communion, self-dissolution, and synthesis, or self-transcendence, are the four characteristics of holons. So this is where I'm going to stop this morning. My time is up. You've been introduced to the basic structure. Now, when I see you again in 2 weeks, I will go through a series of ideas that stem from this basic structure. Ideas having to do with science and sociology and religion, all from the same structure. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is your chance to ask questions now. So, who's first?
It's just a question of curiosity on the chain, the first one that you put up, what time in history was that? Was that BCE or?
The chain idea started with Plato, which is the 3rd and 4th century BC,
Yes.
but it wasn't really well developed until the current era. Plotinus was in the 3rd century of the current era, AD, if you like. And the idea really developed and crystallized over several hundred years there, but it extended, it lived and dominated thinking well through the 16th century, and then after that.
Well, the question I have is
Yeah.
when it showed the hierarchical structure, angels, etc.
Yeah.
Was that before the Christian era, the Common Era?
Yes. Well, I mean, we're talking about development through that period. So Plotinus, whether he had angels in there or not, that drawing came from the 15th to 16th century.
Okay.
But the chain was clearly there.
Yes.
Humans were clearly stratified, for example. So you found a way to exercise for us here.
Pass this down.
Thank you very much. Very stimulating. Some could go the negative way of hearing what you've said and sort of see in the way you've laid things out that the transition through the ages has been a way of eliminating God from the equation. I think some could do that. I suspect that I don't know. I'll be looking forward to the second part. I suspect you're trying to incorporate an idea bigger than what we have normally thought about, what we have labelled God, to try and make that sort of a parsimonious sort of explanation. Am I on the right track, or am I going completely the wrong direction?
I didn't get time to say a few sentences about that this morning. It's obvious that even though it's cut off there, God is not on this diagram. But it's not an atheistic diagram. It is specifically designed just to talk about the real physical world that humans have access to. Can see, measure, touch, and so on. That's all this diagram is meant to refer to. Now, for people who believe in God, and I'll have some things to say about this, I think this provides an opportunity for a very much expanded view of God as creator. But that's a separate issue. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation, Mailen.
Yes.
You titled your presentation Relationships.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting title. I think we can call it also the history of ideas. You mentioned the Paleolithic, that famous paintings in France, in Lascaux. I will add to that the Altamira in Spain.
Yes.
You quoted some historians,
Anthropologists, maybe.
anthropologists that believe this was a magical scene, but there are some others that simply consider just a hunting scene.
Mhm.
But it's an interesting take.
Right.
In the presentation, you mentioned Plato, and it was a good point of reference because basically the thinking, the philosophical idea starts with him. And you mentioned his interesting theory of ideas.
Yeah.
In other words, that the things that are surrounding us are just copies of things, perfect things that are in the transcendental realm. I think we can add to this his interesting theory that is very popular until today, of his dualistic view about the matter and spirit that is very popular with the Catholics, and also many Protestants believe that we have both body and spirit. But very interesting ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this presentation. What about power? Not all animals have the same power, not all organisms have the same power, and in any kind of a realm, there's just this imbalance of power. And I think we have to come to terms with that. What is going on here that some of us can't and some of us do? I think that the question comes up, and then after power, there's this justice. I'm not talking God or anything. I think these questions come up, what happens?
Well, when I get to talk about humans and human relationships and that, which I will do in the second part, I might address some of the issues that you're talking about there. But this diagram is not meant to address all the kinds of relationships between these organisms or creatures. For example, if you really want to describe an ecology, you need to use another kind of organizational structure, which is not a hierarchy, but a network. And networks have a whole series of properties and theories of their own, which I won't go into. I do have a chapter on that in my book, but I'm not going to have time to talk about that here. But people have thought a lot about networks, all the way from game theory to how your Amazon package gets delivered. It's terribly important in the business world now, for example. So there are lots of other things. Here I'm really addressing a very specific issue, which is the relative structure of these various levels here. And there are many other aspects. How these relate in ecologies or human societies is a different matter, important, but I can only say limited things for this structure.
Right here.
Yes.
Yes, I'm trying to apply this to the church, not particularly Adventist church, but just church. And do you have a feeling that churches in the past did best because they were a chain as opposed to a hold-on? And do you think it might be good for a church to move on to being a hold-on rather than a chain?
Well, I hope I can convince you that it's worth thinking about in a church, for example, or for that matter, a university or a business, to recognize that it is a structure whose success in achieving whatever aims it has depends on the relationships between the people involved. Now, from this, there's limited conclusions that I can draw, but I do want to, in the next presentation, point attention to that very strongly. And so I agree with you. It's a nice analogy, I think, that would be well taken at this time.
Well, let me ask you a question, Mailen,
Mhm.
because I got the microphone. But doesn't this network fit more in with the democratic small d society and concept, whereas the older chain of being was much more hierarchical?
Yeah, it had a well-defined and enforced hierarchy, which I have not split apart the human linkages here. I've only made a list of them, but I do want to say some things about those. And you're quite right. It's, well, I'm not a sociologist specialty, but I'll bring some information that I think gives us some direction as to what we could learn about the success of societies and any other groups based on the relationship.
We're going to say it just seems that democracies started, maybe just coincidentally, that they came out at the same time. It might be a result of more of this network.
Right, to get away from the pre-structured hierarchy.
Mailen, did they break down the hierarchy to, like, male and female and children and animals? Did they have any of that? Because you know,
Are you
women
talking
are
about the
second-class citizens
Are you
in
talking
many
about the great
societies.
chain? No. I don't know. I haven't seen diagrams that break the sexes apart, but I suspect their thinking went that way just because society seemed to work that way, unfortunately. But I have not seen any drawings. I've seen more than the one that I showed you here from the 15th, 16th century. But I'm guessing it was pretty much male that they drew.
All right, got one more question here. You get the last word.
I'm honored. Does this have anything to do with the blockchain that's developing now that you read so much about? I'm not talking about cryptocurrency.
No,
I'm just talking
I
about
know
the
what blockchain is,
Right, I'm
yeah.
just wondering if this...
Not really.
Doesn't?
No.
Because I understand that has the potential of really altering society, institutions, and so forth.
It does. We're going to have to deal with it. But
Yeah.
mostly you hear about the good things that it can do. It can protect things
Mhm.
and so on. But have you stopped to think about the fact that it hides transactions completely, even from the government?
True.
So taxes cannot be enforced, for example. So those are some things we're going to have to deal with. But it's a very interesting technology, and it'll find good uses.
I just want to comment that one of the experts had a presentation to the Parliament in Canada on this very thing.
Please.
I said there's a YouTube, excuse me, there's a YouTube presentation where the expert in the field made a presentation to the Parliament in Canada because they're considering that, and they addressed all of these issues, and there seemed to be a pretty good response as to how they can trace, for example, drug deals and so forth.
It's going to be challenging, and
Yeah.
they'll have to work on that.
And like I said, this
Yeah.
is an evolving science as such.
Absolutely. very much so.
All right, well, thank you very much. Mailen, thank you for coming. We look forward to you in 2 weeks. And that's when the exam will be given, correct?
That's right.
Okay.
We'll have a quiz at the beginning to see if you remember anything from this time.
Okay, so anyway, okay, remember next week, Ron Graybill and Gil Valentine will give a report on the recent conference about Adventist history. And then Mailen will be back again in 2 weeks. So let's do our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen. Thank you. We'll see you next week.